So I'm really glad to be here with you guys today. Hopefully, some of the things that I have to say will be helpful. Although, even just right from the beginning, when we're talking about single life in the church, it's actually not really kind of a clear cut issue that there's like totally 100% single-minded like information on. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what that actually means. But like Shannon said, it's super helpful for me if if you're able to have your video on during the talk so I can see faces, because it's so awkward just to like see blank screens or to even not be in front of people and see if people are like nodding off or smiling or whatever. So that's helpful for me. So I'm going to jump right into it. The things that we're basically going to talk about are kind of defining what is single life. So, what is a vocation? What does that look like? And then we're going to talk about some of the basically some of the chatter around that and what the thought is in some various theological writings, although we're not going to get too theological tonight. And then we're going to talk about what that actually means for the lives of people who are single in the church. And then I'll share a little bit about how I kind of came to this vocation of consecrated virginity and what that looked like for me, because I know sometimes it's helpful to hear things that are maybe abstract and out in the wilderness be put into a real perspective in somebody's life. So I'm happy to share that. So basically for me, as Aldrin shared, I had kind of like this long and winding road to this first time when I really encountered the Lord in a very personal way in the sacrament of reconciliation. And I call it kind of like a St. Paul conversion or reversion or whatever you want to call it, because it felt like for me, that was the first time where I encountered God personally in my life and like knew him as a person and his love for me and all of these things. And of course, immediately when that happened, I was like, I have to become a nun. Like, that's what you do when Jesus loves you and you love Jesus. You become a nun, because that's obviously the holiest thing you could ever do with your life, which is actually not the case. But anyways, I was thinking about it even at the time. And then in this course of this long and winding road that eventually brought me to consecrated virginity, the single life was kind of like this perpetually elusive thing that was kind of out there, but which nobody had really kind of defined, or, and I would hear these things. Like, for example, we went on a mission trip to Jamaica with the Missionaries of the Poor. So that was through Newman. We brought some students down. It was great. And I used to hear a lot from some of the Filipino brothers. They would talk a lot about this thing, blessed singleness. So they would talk about blessed singleness. And has anybody heard of that term before? No, kind of ishy. So blessed singleness. So they would talk about this, and I was like, this is interesting. What is blessed singleness? And then at other points, I would hear, okay, so, vocations in the church are marriage or priesthood or religious life or the single life. But then when you look at the single life, it kind of was not so much defined per se. Like, what does that look like? How would you even discern if you have a vocation to that? How would you get that recognized in the church? How does that mean that you have to live? What does it mean that you have to do in your life? Are there any particular requirements for that? But there was never really I never really got any answers that were concrete in all of those things. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but just to back up. So how familiar is everybody here with the concept of vocation? So if you had to have one being, I crawled out from under a rock and know absolutely nothing about anything, that's one. And 5 is, I am St. Thomas Aquinas. If you had to say in terms of vocation knowledge, 1 to 5, stick up your fingers. Which ones are you? 2, 3, 2. Okay. 3. Good. Okay. 2, I guess. Okay. Sweet. Nice. Okay. Cool. So this is super helpful for me. So basically, when we talk about vocation, it comes from the Latin word vocare, which means to call. So I had a vocation retreat that I went on one time with the Sisters of Life. So I know Taylor knows the Sisters of Life, and you guys, Shannon knows, Aldrin, like you guys probably have seen them around Toronto. They're these beautiful sisters who wear this blue habit, and then they have the white veil with the like blue band. They're got some love for them, yes. So I went on a vocation retreat with them, and the sister there had this beautiful way of talking about vocation as not just something that you do, but it's actually first and foremost a gift that you receive from the Lord that is then returned to the Lord with your life. And I thought that was so beautiful. And when we talk about vocation and the word vocare, to be called, in a sense, sometimes we can even think about vocation of like something that you do, like you get married, you have a spouse, you have a life together, you have some kids, you do some Catholic things, and then everybody dies and hopefully you go to heaven. Like that's the, or you become a priest and you do some stuff or whatever. But in reality, all of the vocations that we think about, priesthood, religious life, consecrated life, single life, all of those kind of things are based out of what is our primary vocation. And our primary vocation is the call to holiness. It's called the universal call to holiness. And it was given through us, through our baptism. It was given to us. So this universal call to holiness basically means that I'm called to be a saint. That's it. Like it means you are called to be a saint. Everybody is called to be a saint. And to put that even into a little bit more kind of context of what that looks like is, again, we're going to do 1 to 5. How familiar are some of you guys with theology of the body? If I say that term, 1, crawled out from a rock. 5, jump all 2. 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4. Okay, we got some good. So one of the concepts from theology of the body, or one of the things that happens in that is John Paul II looks at Matthew. So he looks at the question that the Pharisees posed to Jesus about marriage and whether divorce is lawful. And in that context, Jesus points them right back to the very beginning of creation, because he says, from the beginning, it was not so that, divorce and remarriage would be allowed. From the beginning, it was not so. So it's really beautiful if you get a chance to learn more of theology of the body, but the basic kind of concept is that even in the very beginning, through the process of creation, through the process of Adam seeing that he's not God, and he's also not like any of the other creatures, and then seeing Eve be created and knowing that he was created for this communion of persons with Eve, and that this is the meaning of his life. It's like also called the spousal meaning of the body, the nuptial meaning of the body. But basically what it means for every single human being being created in the image and likeness of God is that we were called to make our lives a gift to others. And that we can do that in specific ways. So in terms of that primary vocation, that universal call to holiness, it always means that at every moment of my life, I exist for others. In every moment. And that does not mean that at every moment you must be, like serving the poor, giving out sandwich, like you have to sleep, you have to eat, you have to rest, you have to pray, you have to pick your nose. Sometimes you have to watch Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Like that's not negotiable, So, but it does mean that at every point that I would be open to the Lord loving others through me, to be making a gift of myself to others. So that's the foundation of vocation, is that God has called us into life with him, and we are called to make ourselves a gift to others. So then the more common use of the word vocation is generally related to kind of our state in life. So originally, the 2 states in life in the early church were the ordained state and the lay state. That was it. So you could be ordained, you could be a bishop, you could be a priest, deacon. Those are the 3 kind of ordained states: deacon, priest, bishop. Or you could be a lay person. So that's someone who's not ordained. Generally, you would be married, and that's how you would be answering that call to holiness. However, then you started having in the early church these women called consecrated virgins, who I'm super pumped about because I happen to be a consecrated virgin. So that's fun. But it was women in the early church who really felt called to belong only to the Lord and to be in this kind of spousal relationship with Him, where they would give themselves, be totally single-hearted and single-minded for the Lord, and be able to serve the community in that way. So consecrated virgins were the original form of consecrated life in the church. And what consecrated life essentially is we call it like an eschatological sign. So in heaven, in eternity, every soul will be wed to God, basically. Every soul in the beatific vision in eternity, our union with the Lord will be like a marriage. And so marriage on earth signifies this kind of relationship we can have with the Lord, and consecrated life and priesthood signify our eternal destiny in heaven. It's meant to be a sign, so kind of a living right now of what will be in heaven, where marriage is a sign of it. So how are you guys with me so far? 1, you're stupid. Just kidding. That's so rude. I can't say that. I have a 5-year-old nephew, and my sister would be so scandalized. Don't use that word. Okay, good. We're good. We're all together. So those are the original states in life. The original vocations were to priesthood, to be a deacon, priest, bishop, or to be a lay person. And then from there, consecrated life came out of that. And then consecrated virgins started living together, having congregations together. And then you start to see these religious orders come up. So of men, of women, and then it kind of all kind of goes along from there, right? So what does that mean for how we talk about vocations today? Well, I should mention one other thing. So there's also a possibility of having a vocation within a vocation. So that's kind of like something when you think about Mother Teresa, for example. So she entered this vocation of religious life, and she was already in this vocation of religious life. And within that vocation of religious life, she experienced another call to go and serve the poor. And so then she got permission to leave the religious congregation that she was with and to go and to serve the poor in Calcutta, right? And for some people, that might be something like taking care of elderly parents. It might be somebody who is a musician and travels all over the world all of the time, and through beauty is able to bring God's presence to others. It might be somebody who's a psychiatrist or a doctor. It might be somebody who's a missionary in a foreign place. Things like that could be a call within a call. So a call within whatever vocation. But the thing about that is all of those particular calls also work within the big V vocation that we're called to. So like God is not going to call a mom of 6 to all of a sudden leave her family and go be a missionary by herself somewhere in the world, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. So however we think about vocation, the bottom line for everything is it is a call to be gift for other people. It's a call to give ourselves in love. So the reason I wanted to spend that much time talking about what a vocation is so that it makes a little bit more sense when we can talk about, okay, what does the church actually say about single life, what it is, what it's not, all of these things. So this is the common denominator, okay? So giving ourselves away in love and being able to do that. So there are a lot of questions around single life in the church. Does anybody here kind of feel like there's some question, or like it seems a little bit elusive, like what it is, if it exists, how it exists? Like, yes, a little bit. Yeah. So that's kind of definitely how I felt, and when I would hear things like, okay, blessed singleness, like what it is, or read like on some websites, even when I was preparing for this talk, I just typed into Google, vocation, single life, Catholic. That's it. And then I looked, and then even between different dioceses, there is dispute about whether there is a vocation to the single life or not. But why is that? So there are some people kind of who say, yes, there is a vocation to the single life. And we can kind of know that because we can see it throughout the history of the church, that there are some who never were married and who gave themselves fully to the Lord. There was fruit from their lives. They didn't get married. They didn't enter religious life. They didn't do vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, all of those kind of things. And it's also possible for somebody to experience a call to a new vocation, right? So, for example, like one of the arguments against single life being a vocation, or not, one of the arguments that single life is not a vocation, thank you, that's much better, is that vocations necessarily kind of shut the door on other vocations. So for example, if you enter into marriage, then you have shut the door to priesthood, you've shut the door to religious life, because you've been totally committed to giving yourself in love in this thing, right? In this way. So that's an argument saying like single life can't be a vocation, because there's still always the possibility, because there's no kind of formalization of that, per se. So because of that, it doesn't shut the door to anything. So how can that be a vocation, right? But then the counter argument to that is like, okay, but some people can experience multiple vocations in their life. So for example, it was super cool. I don't know if you guys has anybody gone to the Ordinandy dinner before? Yeah. Oh, so good. So if you don't know what the Ordinandy dinner is, highly recommend. You could talk to Shannon or Aldrin after and see maybe if they can snag you some tickets for it this year, if they have it in person. But regardless, the Ordinandy dinner is where all of the men who are going to be ordained to the priesthood in the coming year, there's a dinner to celebrate them. And it's put on by the Sarah Club, and it is 100%. Like, it's been a highlight of my year every year, because it's been so beautiful to see these men stand up in front of a room full of literally thousands and share the depth of their heart for the Lord. Maybe not quite that, like it's not like a 5-hour thing of like how the Lord has loved their soul, but but they really are sharing the personal love of God that they've experienced and how that turned into a vocation for them, this call and their own answer. It's so beautiful, so beautiful. And there was one priest, and honestly, I can't even remember what his name is. I think he's from Hamilton, but he actually remembers with his wife, because he was married, remembers with his wife dropping his girls off at university when they entered university. And then sadly, a number of years after that, his wife passed away fairly young. And after that, he discerned this call to priesthood. And that was kind of affirmed by the diocese, like, yes, we also hear this call. And then it's so cool, because when he joined his formation, he went to St. Augustine's for priestly formation, and his daughters were the ones to drive him and drop him off at school. Isn't that awesome? So cool. Yeah, so that's pretty cool. And it can be, so one person can experience in some ways, like, although it is rare, but people can experience kind of more than one vocation, right? And another example of that would be somebody who's called to be a deacon, because deacons, when they're not transitional, so if somebody's becoming a priest, before they become a priest, about 6 months before, they're ordained to the transitional diaconate. So they're a deacon for about 6 months or so before they're ordained to the priesthood. But there are permanent deacons in the church who are called to assist, to serve the poor, to assist at Mass, to do all of those kind of things. And so deacons can be married, right? So they can, in a sense, be in two vocations. So again, when I was looking at these websites, I'm like, okay, the Diocese of Lansing, for example, says, nope, there's not a vocation to single life. But then the Diocese of, oh gosh, I forget where else I was looking. Anyways, one of the other dioceses in the US says, yes, there is absolutely a vocation to single life. So here's what I thought I would do. I'm going to share with you something that it was really helpful for me, and hopefully it will be helpful for you. Okay, so you guys can all see this? Great. You don't it's not a real Zoom call until somebody asks, is my mic on? Or you hear somebody say, you're muted. Or like, can you see my screen? Okay. Anyways, so this is called the vocation tree. So if you go to vocationtree.org, it actually has an interactive thing where you can look at all of the different kind of vocations that are part of it. And it has like an explanation of all of them and some information that is just helpful, kind of seeing how things lie on the vocation spectrum, right? So starting with the beginning, our baptismal vocation, this is exactly what I was talking about. You were created to love. You were created to give yourself away in a gift of love. Your primary vocation is to holiness. And then you have state in life or vocation. So here we go. Let's start with ordained because that's the simplest one. So a person can be ordained. So that is if they feel that they have a call to become a priest or a deacon. So if somebody is kind of on this ordained path, then they would be celibate unless they are already a married guy who's becoming a deacon. And you can be ordained a deacon, you can be ordained a priest, you can be ordained a bishop. So the bishop is the fullness of the ordination ordinatory orders, whatever. Anyways, so that's kind of this branch of the tree, right? The interesting thing about this is that baptism, when we're baptized, it leaves an indelible mark on our soul. So something that changes our soul irrevocably. It is always there. It can never be removed. And in the same way, when somebody is ordained, that exists as well. So even if we talk about priests, you sometimes hear in the media a priest being defrocked, which is not a thing. Like it's not a real word. It's a kind of a word that people have used for a while, but the actual term would be like laicized, we'll often say, or there's another fancier term with canon law, but even in that, because ordination places an indelible mark on the soul, if somebody is a deacon, a priest, or bishop, they will always be a deacon or priest or bishop by that ordination. But it also is the case that if somebody is, for example, like laicized, if they're no longer in the clerical state, then it means that they actually don't have the right or the permission from the bishop where they are, or from the Holy Father, depending on who's giving the permission, to exercise the functions in those things. So in that case, for example, somebody who's a priest could then be given dispensation for marriage, for example. So that's ordained ministry. So laity. Let's go consecrated life first. Okay, so also I'd just like to point out that I know this is super hard to read. So it looks like if you're ordained, that you're ordained first as a dragon, and then as a irises. Anyways, so you just have to go take a look for yourself. So consecrated life. So what does consecrated life mean? Consecrated life is a celibate life. So it means that instead of marriage, instead of giving themselves in imaging this relationship with God through giving themselves totally to one person and being open to children, it would mean giving oneself, being totally undivided for the Lord in a sense, and freely able to serve the church in that way. So what are things that belong to consecrated life? So consecrated virgins living in the world. So that would be my vocation. And then you also have apostolic religious life. That's what that one says. So then you have secular institutes, contemplative institutes, diocesan hermits. So there are hermits, just in case you didn't know, that's like a thing where somebody kind of lives on their own in like a hut and they get all wise and stuff. So that's a thing. And then you have monastic life in the West and the East. So those are all forms of consecrated life. And so you kind of notice that single life is not really in there. And then laity is the third branch of the tree. So again, you kind of remember that in the early church, there was just ordained and laity because there wasn't really consecrated life. And then once consecrated life sprung up, then now you can see there's tons of ways of living consecrated life. And so then in this laity, you have married. So that's the majority of people. You can note the thickness of the branch kind of represents that the majority of baptized Christians will enter into the vocation, be called to and enter into the vocation of marriage. And then you have this branch here, which is what we're talking about. So dedicated singles. So what does that mean? Again, it's like, okay, I get it. What does it mean? So essentially, let me just stop sharing now. Get my notes back up. Good. So what does that mean? Well, it's actually true that in the church, there's a canon, I think it's canon 604, that talks about new forms of consecrated life that can be recognized in the church. And it is true that a state in life, so for example, all of us are born into the state of life of singleness. Every single person, 0 people are born married. That is not how it works. So every person is born and will be in the state of life, single life, at some point in their life, from like a good majority of the beginning part of their life, you know? But if someone is in that single state in their life, it's not a vocation necessarily. So what that tree is basically saying is that there are some who are called by God to remain in that single state for a purpose. And they answer that call from God in some way that is concrete and involves some kind of commitment and involves some kind of formalizing process. So when you look at the tree branch of consecrated people, there is for all of them a public recognition by the church. So for my own vocation, for example, for consecrated virginity, what happened with me when I was discerning was I went through kind of a few years of discernment, and it wasn't just me saying, yeah, I feel like I'm called to this, but it was also the church discerning through the people who were entrusted to that discernment. So namely Bishop Wasano and a woman named Mary, who's also a consecrated virgin. And it was also up to them to say, yes, we see this call on behalf of the church in Erin's life, before I was able to receive the consecration. It's the same with priesthood. Nobody can become a priest by their own volition. It doesn't work that way. Nobody can become, I'm actually super grateful that that's the case, because I totally would have joined probably like 6 religious orders and I don't have a vocation to any of them. So, but I'm grateful that they were like, yeah, you don't belong here. Not that mean, but in a very nice way, you know, like we don't hear a call for you to join our religious order. So, so when we speak about single vocation, it's not a vocation for those who are single, but are single by default, essentially. So they haven't found somebody to marry yet, but they feel called to marriage, or they feel called to priesthood or religious life, and they're kind of in the process of discerning that or things. That's not a vocation, because in some sense, vocation is something that we necessarily need to enter into with intentionality and with commitment, and it has to be received and affirmed in some way by the church. So what could that look like, for example, in somebody who does feel a call from God, either through their situation, because sometimes God speaks very loudly in our situations, right? Like for me, one of the reasons why I didn't enter religious life is because I have some health restrictions, and they're not things that are like, yeah, like they're not things that prevent me kind of mostly living my daily life, but they're enough that it would prevent me from living religious life in the way that that would be kind of required. So in those circumstances, the Lord for me shut that door, right? And for some people, it might be that the single life is like they have an elderly parent and they may need to care for that parent for a period of time, right? And so it might be possible that the Lord is calling them to dedicated singleness for a time. And that could really, in some sense, be called a vocation, right? But in terms of formalization and how that works in the church, I think that's the difficult part, is that right now there is not really a way to formalize that dedicated singleness in kind of a public profession, aside from something that you might do privately with a spiritual director, for example. So for me, when I was discerning consecrated, like I was discerning consecrated virginity, basically what happened was I ended up doing a temporary private promise of celibacy that my spiritual director received for 1 year. It was temporary. That was even when I did the promise, like I included those words in my promise, temporary for 1 year, to see what kind of fruits were in it so that I could discern better if the Lord was calling me to remain in this state for the rest of my life. And there are some people who will have their spiritual director receive a promise of celibacy because that's 100% part of a dedicated singles life, because well, I mean, that's a whole other talk, but because sexual intimacy is reserved for marital union, right? So that's a whole other talk if you want to talk about that. Yeah, so it would be kind of a promise of celibacy. And if somebody is a dedicated single, they also would not be able to do a promise of poverty. So take a vow of poverty, essentially, because they would need to be able to support themselves somehow, or to own things or to use things like clothing or cars or things like that. And they also wouldn't necessarily be able to take a vow of obedience. So those are the three common vows that are taken by religious, right? Everybody kind of on the consecrated side would take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, except for consecrated virgins. So I can get back to that in a minute. But really, that obedience wouldn't necessarily be possible for somebody in a dedicated single life, because who are they obedient to? Their spiritual director, like in some sense, yes, but really, it's kind of one of those things. Like it's possible to formalize it in some way with a spiritual director, but not in necessarily with like a public mass, or to be formally consecrated by a rite that is promulgated by the Catholic Church, for example. So that's, I think, where the church really does have right now a responsibility to look at this question of what this means for people. And partly this is even more pressing than it has been. And why I think there's been such muddledness around it is because if you look at the dynamic of the lives of young adults in the world, it is markedly different than it has been in recent decades, right? And throughout all of history, because it would have been very normal for someone to be married. I mean, if you think about the early church, right? Like you get married when you're young. Like that's it. That's what you do, or you become a priest, And even when, even in up to, like, if you think about the 50s, for example, it would have been very, like, pretty uncommon for someone not to be married by the time they're 30, let's say. And part of that has to do with cultural things, like things that are making it hard for those who are young adults to make commitments. So part of it, I think, is the incredibly high divorce rate, for example. So a lot of people are actually very skeptical about marriage, or might have been wounded by divorce in their own families. It also might be possible that, let's see, I had some other examples here. Oh yeah, part of it, I think, also is prayer too, about knowing what vocation you can enter into, and really being able to discern a vocation entails having a deep and dedicated prayer life, or some way for the Lord to speak to you to give this gift of a vocation to be able to be received. And if that prayer life is not there, then there isn't really an entry into vocation in the way that the Lord wants to give this gift to us, right? And that's a challenge, because I think that we've not done a good job as a church in the past few decades in really teaching people how to pray, or at least that's my experience anyways, in kind of growing up Catholic, but also forming young adult Catholics. And then also even the question of education. So I'm sure you guys have kind of found this, but when I was at Newman, there were tons of students that I talked to who were like seriously dating somebody, and we're like, okay, but we're both not graduating for 7 years from our prescribed grad programs. And so we're not going to get married for 10 years. Like, oh, okay, like I understand. And it's also can be a very cultural thing, right? Like there's one of the students who, a couple of Korean students actually. So in Korea, that would be a more kind of normalized part of culture, right? Like you finish your education before you get married because it's a pragmatic thing. You want to be able to support your spouse, your children, all of those kind of things. So sometimes it can definitely be cultural too, right? But for all of these reasons, we now have all of these young adult Catholics who are single, and there's questions about what that means. Like, am I called to singleness? Like, what if I haven't found a spouse? How would I even discern a vocation to singleness? Like all of these kind of things, right? And so with that, I think it can be, we can say that there are some things that we know. So for example, vocation entails commitment somehow, whether that is formalized by the church or whether it's done through a spiritual director. Vocation entails discernment. So it entails having a call from the Lord and discerning that call well with somebody who is walking with you, whether it is a vocations director from the diocese, whether it's your own spiritual director, whether it's a religious institute, whether it's the person that you are hoping will be your spouse. That would be important as well, to discern with that person if you're looking at marriage. All of those kind of things, right? So those are things that are necessary for vocation for sure. So when we look at the single life, we can say those things for sure, but I think it is also good and holy and necessary to say of our church, that's not enough. Like, it's not enough, because there are all of these young adults who are finding themselves in this situation where they're really trying to see, like, what is your call for my life, Lord? And because there is some question about this particular branch on the tree, dedicated singleness, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do you know? Where do I fit in the church? What does that mean for my life? Can it change at later points in my life? Like, is there some way I can commit myself permanently to it in a way that it won't change? All of these things are questions. And these, I can tell you for sure, having, so Emily Callan was one of the people from Canada who actually got to go to the youth synod that they had in Rome a few years ago, right? And so her and I were talking afterwards, and she said that this was actually a large question, like a question brought up not just from people in Western countries, but from around the world. And it was things that they talked about this question of being single in the church and what does it mean? And is it referred to as a vocation? And if so, what does that mean? And what does that look like, right? So I think that it's okay for us to keep pushing for answers to that. And I am sure that the Holy Spirit is in that, because the Holy Spirit speaks in clarity, not in confusion. So if there is a call for clarity, I believe that is the Holy Spirit who is calling that forth from the church for sure. So that's, I think, important to know. So just to share in the last couple minutes, we got like a couple minutes. Is that true? Yeah? Okay, good. So in the last couple minutes, I can just share for you in terms of my own call, how I experienced that. So definitely, again, when I had this kind of conversion, I did experience this call to like kind of belong to the Lord. And part of that was just super zeal from being super pumped at being Catholic. And part of that was actually kind of authentic, you know? And so in the next few years, I actually had discerned with a religious order in Ottawa. So I joined for a year and a half. And unfortunately for me, when I left, it was actually under really painful circumstances. It was not peaceful. It was very wounding for me. And I think it's also okay to say that too, in terms of vocational discernment, is that it's not an easy peasy thing and something that is like, oh Lord, you're romancing my heart. Like, yeah, okay. Yes, sometimes, yeah, sure, you know, but like there is a lot of pain. And so in that experience, after that kind of time where I felt really wounded in that experience, it was a number of years and a lot of kind of very gentle healing that the Lord was doing in me. Yeah, for me to really believe that, because essentially when I experienced that wound, it was a wound of feeling like I was not lovable, like I was not, like I couldn't be loved. Um, and so he really had to do a lot of major healing in that, you know? And so when he had kind of stripped away a lot of those layers and brought some really significant healing to that wound, it was then that I really started to feel him calling in that way. Like I just had this sense of like that I wasn't made for marriage. Like I love marriage and it's a beautiful thing, you know? Um, and I didn't feel like I was running from it, but I really felt called to it. Um, or to consecrated life. And so then I was like, okay, Lord, this is great. Like, I'm going to start discerning with some religious orders. So I discerned a little bit. Like, I went on a couple of commencies with the Sisters of Life. I went to a couple of commencies with different religious orders. And it was like the Lord was shutting every door when I would go on one of these commencies. And he's like, yep, no, this is not it. This is not it. And it was so painful and frustrating for me because I felt like I'm trying to give myself to you, Jesus. And I feel like you said that you want me, but you don't want me. Like, what is happening? So I was getting so frustrated with that. And then it actually was kind of funny because my spiritual director was like, okay, listen, put on some makeup, do your hair nice and dress in some nice clothes, go to some places where there's going to be some young, eligible Catholic men, and then see what happens. And I was like, okay, do you even know me? I've never worn makeup in my life, but I'm going to do this. So I literally had to go out and buy makeup to put makeup on to go and like, I don't know, like romance men at the source. So whatever. So I went to the source a couple of times and like I've been to the source tons of times if any of you guys have been to the source and there's like single people there. There's just tons of single people there. And I knew there was lots of single guys there. And obviously if they're going to adore the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, they're the kind of single guys that I could like conceivably date, you know? Anyways, long story short, 2 sources in a row I went, zero, like not a single eligible Catholic man was at either of those sources I went. So I was like, okay, Lord, I'm taking this as like a sign from you. Like I feel super uncomfortable because I don't feel like this is what you're calling me to. This is happening. So then the Lord shut that door. And I was like, okay, well, if it's not religious orders and it's not married life, I don't know what the heck you want me to do with my life because that's all I think there is. And so at that point, I was like, it must be single life. Like you must be calling me to single life. But again, what the heck is that? What am I supposed to do now? But then I found out about consecrated virginity. And for me, the thing about thinking about single life that I found like most perplexing was like I had a desire for commitment. I had a desire to be living a vocation in such a way that it actually excluded the possibilities of other vocations because I know that in our lives, we are going to have days in whatever vocation we end up in where we second guess our choice, where we think about like, should I have done this? Should I have married this person? Should I have entered this religious order? Yikes. Or days where it's so hard, where you're caring for young kids, you have no sleep, and where it's like it would be so easy in those times to back out if not for the yes that you give to things. So I had this huge desire to give a yes to something. Like to give this yes that I felt like the Lord was giving me this gift of belonging only to him, but then to give my yes to something, but how to do that, you know? And I also felt like, especially for the single life, like when I would talk to some women friends, they would be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get married. I'm 24 and I'm not dating anybody. And I'm going to get married. Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whatever. I never felt like that. So I was like, okay, this is good. You know, I feel like I really am kind of called to consecrated life. And I also have always found this joy of being free, like free with a freedom to go anywhere, to do anything, to move here, to go here, to serve here, to go in this way. Like I find it exciting to not know what the rest of my life has in store. Whereas for some people, that would be literally the worst thing they could ever picture in their entire life, you know? But for me, that's not how I was created. Like, I love that sense of adventure and joy and like man, it's so exciting to me. So those were some of the things that I was kind of discerning with. And when I felt really like I was kind of starting to be open to this idea of single life, it was then that I really kind of stumbled on consecrated virginity and started discerning that, and in an intentional way. And then as I was discerning that, it was like everything was kind of clicking in me. Like, yes, like the ways that I know I'm created to love God, I can love him in here, you know? And so just to round it out and bring it back right to the beginning is to look at this call to love, you know? So even if you are single, even if you are feeling a call potentially to remain in that singleness for some reason, whether it's, because there's no male equivalent to consecrated virginity, for example. So whether the Lord would do something new in your life to bring about another form of consecrated life for the good of the church, maybe through you, is something that's possible, you know? So really, if you're discerning that kind of call to remain single for something, to know that it's okay if you feel like there's some nebulousness there, but also to know that there are those things that are necessary for vocation, that commitment, that kind of recognition by the church somehow. All of those things are necessary. And then I would definitely encourage you to go and talk to the vocation director for the diocese, or or to other people who are maybe living that state now, that you might feel a call to be able to talk to them and see what that looks like for them, what they felt like when they were discerning that, and all of those things, because that can be super helpful. Pray. If you do not do anything else, just pray and get a spiritual director. And those are huge things. And take a step too. Like, vocation paralysis is a thing. It is not true that you have to have your vocation figured out before you take a step in some direction. It is true that you have to take a step in some direction to let the Lord shut or open doors for you and to show you how you were created to love.